Chapter 21 of Genesis, of Bereshit, reminds us that people can indeed be very harsh to one another. There's no getting around it. This chapter is difficult to read, and yet the rabbis place it as the central reading on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. They're not to remind us how exactly to behave, but definitely to hold up a mirror into our lives and say, is this the way that you think life needs to be? Is this the way you want to behave towards those who help build your family? Is this the way that you want to see history unfold? And given the challenge that this chapter of Genesis presents, we can read it and we can read the contents and understand it in the greater context of the questions it faces us with as we come to it in our cycle of weekly readings this year, after Rosh Hashanah, of course. Sarah has a child as God had promised at that time that was appointed. There's reason to be grateful. There's reason to have faith that God indeed will provide and make good every promise that had been sworn to our ancestors. But when the child grew and was weaned, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. And in general, what we saw in Rashi's commentary was that Sarah saw Ishmael shooting arrows at her boy, shooting fireballs even, as it says, "Halo misachek ani?" Oh, I'm just joking. Well, sometimes just joking doesn't convince us that it's safe to have our children around those who are bullies, around those who would tend towards violence. Oh, they're just demonstrating. They're just chanting those murderous slogans. We wouldn't go near them. Sarah wouldn't go near Ishmael, didn't want him nor his mother around in her home any longer, and tells Abraham to send them away. Enough, enough. Sarah noticed how harsh Ishmael was treating Isaac, and indeed they were sent, given a bread and a skin of water, set out on a journey. And the question becomes, even though it tells us that Abraham was upset by the entire episode, why couldn't he give them a little bit more? Just bread and a skin of water? Was that a stand-in for all the provision they needed to make that journey? Did they trust that they would find an oasis, another tent in which to receive hospitality? We're troubled. We're troubled by Sarah's immediate and rash decision to cast them out. We're troubled that God has Abraham give them just a little bread and one skin of water. Life can be harsh. People can be harsh to one another. How in family constellations can we sense any wholeness if there's just this kind of brokenness in the first family's unfolding story? And in fact, we're given a little hope that things are working as God needs them to work. In verse 17, it says, God heard the voice of the youth. Vayishma Elohim et kol ha'na'ar. Vayikra malach Elohim el Hagar. And an angel called out to Hagar, the boy's mother. When God heard Yishmael, when God heard Hagar's distress, God responds, promises them a greater future. A people would be born of Yishmael. There's a small section of verse 17 that says, "For God had heeded the cry of the youth, Ba'asher Husham," as he is there. God did not look towards the future guilt of what was foretold to be of the people or peoples that would come later in Yishmael's lineage. God heard a youth crying. God heard a suffering soul and responded in where he was in that moment of his despondency. And he lifted them both, and despite the fact that he would tell them, God will be with you, and that even there would be future troubles between the peoples of Yishmael and the Jewish people, and that life can be harsh when it comes to the unfolding chapters of history. There is some sense that compassion wins out in certain moments when the need to respond arises. This is all the foreground story to a very, very important test of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham being the protagonist in the Akedat Yitzchak story, the binding of Isaac, but Sarah's absence making her quite the protagonist as well. It seems as though these decisions in chapter 21 and these hardships in family life led to a rupture within their communications. Neither is there dialogue before the Akedah with Sarah about whether or not this is a good idea, nor is there any communication with his wife after the binding of Isaac episode. Abraham and Sarah don't speak, just as Abraham and Isaac never talk again in the Torah. So chapters 21 and 22 have become the central readings on Rosh Hashanah during our services. They are mirrors so that we can reflect about how we might like our lives to unfold, even the complicated new family arrangements that sometimes human beings find themselves creating, even the kind of fighting families that sometimes appear on the face of the earth, even the fundamentalist challenges to our sense of wholeness and safety. We have to overcome fears and be courageous in our morality and our relationship with God that leads to only goodness. So this is an essential part of the Torah to review, but we've read it at Rosh Hashanah and we would quickly hear it being chanted. Worth reading chapters 21 and 22 of Genesis particularly, and delving into them to find the messages for us so that we can annul the harshness of the decree, especially when it's us being the ones who are harsh. Shabbat Shalom.